Hey y'all, I'm Jay and I am back once again to share the things that I'm making with Framer X, this time from a hotel room high above the city of Seattle, Washington. I started off this series by saying that I'm open to suggestions about the things that I'm making on here, and Maximilian left this comment on one of my other videos. These are some sweet tutorials on Framer X. I'd love to understand more about dragging items, or something like a Tinder-like swipe. And I was all duly noted, and I actually meant it. And in this video, we're going to be making a draggable card using Framer X. Now in my last video, I know that I expressed my love for keeping it relatively simple with code overrides, but I think that this particular task, it's going to require getting into the very serious business of creating a real deal code component. And we're also going to get to snoop around a little bit to learn about some undocumented Framer X features. So if you're following along, get your text editor ready and let's get started. I'm going to build this draggable card prototype with a card that'll snap back into place if I just move it a little bit, that'll rotate as I move it around, and that I can swipe off either side of the screen. Now Framer X comes with a draggable element that you can use to enable this, but it's not in the docs yet, so I had to do a little bit of digging around to figure out how to use it. Besides searching in the Facebook group and the Slack channel, there are a couple of other things you can do to uncover and learn about some of these as yet undocumented features of Framer X, like draggable. The first one isn't much of a trick at all. It's just kind of fun to install other people's components and then poke around and see how they work. By exploring other people's code, you end up discovering new things. So for example, let's install this rad bottom sheet component. Once it's installed, there are two ways to explore the source code of any component that you download from the store. The first one's about as easy as it gets. If I right-click the component in the component sidebar, I can copy code and then paste it into a file. I could also dig into the Framer project folder itself and find the code for this component. In the File menu, I'll select Show Project Folder, and it opens this folder up in the Finder, which I'll just drag to VS Code so we can take a look inside. This container folder is actually where all of the code and assets from your project live, along with all the components you installed, and also the Framer library itself. Framer installs code components in here, in the Node Modules folder, and then the @Framer folder, where you can find the bottom sheet component in here in the code folder. So I mainly just stumble around in here and soak up games, see whatever I can reverse engineer, and down here at the bottom, would you look at that, there's a thing called Draggable. If you've used Framer Classic, we had Draggable then, and lo and behold, we have something like that in X2. We can actually learn a lot just from seeing how it's used in this component. But while we're digging around in here, let's also look at another way to get under the hood of Framer itself. Back here in this Node Modules folder, there's another Framer folder, and in here, in the build folder, is where the actual Framer library itself lives. Framer.js itself is minimized, but framer.debug.js isn't. And then here you have Framer's TypeScript declarations in framer.d.ts. Now I'm going to be real with y'all and say outright that even though I'm here making videos about a product that uses TypeScript, as of now I know very little about how TypeScript works. What I do know though is that if I search this file for Draggable, I can start to create a picture of how to work with it. Like here's the actual declaration for the Draggable module, which looks like it imports another module called with dragging. And then once I find with dragging, I can see that there are a ton of what look like events that I can listen to. Like here's on move and on drag animation start, and then a bunch of these properties also that might prove useful. This is how I started piecing together how the page component worked a few videos ago, and it's also how I figured out some of the scroll stuff from my last video. Here's the scroll module. It doesn't have all the answers in here, but it has a lot of clues in absence of docs that spell it all out for us. Okay, let's close all this out so we can take some of these new and exciting clues that we found and put them to work building a draggable card. As usual, I'm cheating. I pre-made a couple of things, a device frame, and then a card featuring this handsome fellow that we can swipe right on. So right away, I'm going to create a code component for this draggable card, which I shall call Draggable Card, and I'll hit the Create and Edit button, which will open it up in VS Code. It's already pre-filled with some sample code, just like code overrides. Now Framer has their own docs, and there are also some great tutorials out there already that get into the anatomy of code components, so I'll be here if you want to read them or watch them, and when you get back, the first thing that I'm going to do is delete most of this example code except for the imports, the class itself, and this render function. I'm going to change what I'm importing here to our new friend Draggable, and our old friends Animate and Animatable, which we'll use later. Let's drag an instance of this component into our device frame, and that's not the best look, so we're going to get rid of this error first. The render function here is where the magic happens, since what we return in here is what will get rendered in our prototype. I'm going to delete the old code that's causing that error, and I'll replace it with an instance of Draggable. I'll set the initial height and width to this.props.height and this.props.width. I'll also make the background transparent because we won't need that blue background in a second from now. And finally, I'll also sandwich right between Draggable's open and close tags this.props.children. So you can see back here in Framer that thanks to the addition of this .props.children to the render method, my component now has this little handle on it. It's similar to the one that we get when we use the scroll tool or the page tool. And similar to those, I can drag from this handle to any frame, this frame now becoming a child of my component and rendering just as it should. I'll adjust the dimensions of this real quick now, and I'll center it in the device frame. What's great about this is that if I want to swap the card out, maybe for this other orange guy that's hiding over here, it's just a matter of connecting it to the new frame. But okay, you guys ready for this? In the preview, you can see that I'm already able to drag this card around, and when I release it, it snaps back to its initial position. It's got an animation that runs when drag ends. Not a bad first step. Let's pause for a second and think about what should happen next. If I drag this little guy over to the right enough, I want him to fly off screen to the right. Same thing if I drag him over to the left. And if I just drag him a little bit, the behavior that happens right now, it's actually fine. He should just snap back into the center as he's already doing. So I'm gonna start by tracking the left position of this card as I move it, and I'll do that using Draggable's onMove event. It'll trigger a function which I'll call moveHandler. The onMove event gives us a point, and I'll store that point's x value in a variable called lastLeft. Next thing I'll do, back down here right next to our onMove listener, I'll add another listener for another event, onDragEnd. It'll similarly trigger a new function called dragEndHandler. In here, just to test this out, I'll add a console log to see what that last left value is when I release the card. So back in preview, this is working, and every time I let go of the card, I'm getting a value. There is, without a doubt, a more precise mathematical way to figure this next thing out, but I'm just going to drag this guy around enough to get a sense of what the tolerance should be for the distance at which we should animate the card out of the frame. It looks like about 45, 46 on the left, and negative 45 on the right. Back here in our components code, I'm going to add a conditional to the dragEndHandler function. If this .lastLeft is greater or equal to 45, we're going to do one thing, and if it's less than or equal to negative 45, we'll do something else. And that thing is going to be animating the card off one way or the other. To do this, I'll create a state object in the component and add a property called left, which defaults to an animatable value of 0. And then I'm going to animate it to, I'll just pick an arbitrary distance of 500 if it's a swipe to the right, and negative 500 if it's a swipe to the left. Then the last thing that I'll do is down here in the render method, add a value to the draggable element that sets its left property to this.state.left. If you've been doing animation with code overrides, this pattern might seem familiar. We store an animatable value in an object, data in overrides, state in components. We assign that value to a property of the thing you want to animate, like our left value of the draggable element, and then finally we animate the value. I'm going to pop back open the preview, and yeah, there it is. I can swipe either way on our little fella and off he goes. Dragging the card around still feels a little stilted though, so maybe if it rotated a bit based on its left position, that would help. Back here in the code component, I'll add a rotation property to the state object, and to start off here in the moveHandler method, I'll just see what happens if I set state.rotation to point.x. The other part of this is going to be updating the draggable element in the render method to set its rotation property to our state.rotation value. And back over to preview, and damn, that's kind of intense, so let's dial it down just a little bit. Back over in the code component's moveHandler method. I'll divide that point x value by 5. And now the motion's a little more natural. Honestly, we could stop right here. This is pretty decent. I have a little bit of an issue with the animation on either side. It's kind of slow, and while that seems like it should be an easy fix to just adjust the animation's duration, it turns out it gets a little more complicated. For the sake of time, I'll go through this code pretty quick, but the sample project in the description is there to check out at your leisure. Back in the code component, I can change the duration on both of these animations to ease out over a quarter second, which should fix the slowness. What's actually happening here is that the same nice built-in animation that settles this card back into place is conflicting with our animations when we decrease their duration. The quick version of how I'm going to address this is by listening for another draggable event, the onDragAnimationStart event, which gives us a reference to an animation that's about to start. I'm going to store this animation in a variable, dragReturnAnimation, and now what I can do is cancel this animation if I've swiped past my tolerance one way or the other. First, I'll write a method called killBuiltinAnimation that cancels both the X and Y animations when we call it. Then I'll actually write my own resetCard method to implement a little custom transition that scales up a new instance of our card by resetting it to the center, then scaling it up quickly from 0, which will first require adding a few new properties to both state and the draggable element, which I'll basically zero out and then scale back up in this resetCard method. I'll call resetCard onDragEnd after each of these swipe off animations run by marking this dragEndHandler function as async and then awaiting these animations to finish before running it. Now back to the preview one last time, and I've got myself a snappier animation and a nice pop back in after that transition completes. Building this helped me understand a little more about how dragging works in Framer X, but honestly, this little swipeable card just scratches the surface. I feel like there's a lot more to explore. I imagine that at some point in the near future, Draggable is just going to get integrated into the UI the same way the page tool did, but for now, I see some more digging around with Draggable in my near future. Thanks again for watching, and I'll see y'all soon.